It's kind of an insane idea to make a role-playing game based on a painting. That's not to say it hasn't been done. Laurie O'Connell, author of the Hieronymus Hexcrawl, hosted a paintings jam to inspire this exact sort of work, which spawned games such as David Blandy's Babel, which centers Peter Bruegel's imagination of the legendary tower, or Yannon's Stories to Astonish the World, which uses traditional Chinese scenery as a background for point crawls. But these games start with their inspirational media as a foundation, and build mechanical structures on top. Lex Kim Bobro's Nighthawks is doing something different. Based on the iconic 1942 Edward Hopper scene, Nighthawks not only draws its themes from the original work, but also wields the painting itself as a cudgel to beat those themes into the reader's head. Aside from this little dragon line breaker, the only piece of art in the game is Nighthawks. Bobro dissects the painting, pastes it what appears to be haphazardly across the text, using it both as background and page divider. It's a strange choice, but an interesting one I'm hoping to examine in this essay. I'm not much of an art critic, and I somewhat famously think layout is not as important as a game's words, but I do think Bobro's odd choice of visual design supports their ultimate goal, one of presenting the reader with a work that is at once challenging and earnest. First, a little history. Edward Hopper was a 20th century artist, primarily a realist painter. According to a children's book I found at my library, Hopper grew up in New York, studied in Paris, and after some initial difficulties, found success in the art world with his works that focused on solitary scenes of everyday people, scenes that often played with the contrast between light and dark. When he began his most recognizable piece, it was in the shadow of the Second World War, soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor. According to Sarah Kelly Oler of the Art Institute of Chicago, the darkness of the landscape outside the diner is likely a reflection of the blackouts instituted to discourage bombing. That contradiction, the bright yellow wall of the diner, contrasted with the gloom of the city outside, draws attention to the four figures who seek solace inside. And it's the strange relationship between the four that really get people going, because if you look closely, none of them are looking at each other. The central couple is not engaged in conversation, though perhaps they're sharing a cigarette. The man with the beak nose that inspired the painting's name is looking through the soda jerk, and the soda jerk looks past him into the closed shop across the way. The largest figure, back turned to the viewer, stares over the first man's shoulder, elbows on the table, holding a glass perhaps. It's this strange relationship between the four characters, combined with the fact that the viewer is on the outside looking in, that has sparked interpretation of Nighthawks as a piece about loneliness. Bobro's Nighthawks takes the same position. The stated goal of the text is to create some sort of connection between isolated individuals at an inescapable location, though Bobro himself concedes that you're probably going to end up at a diner. Based on the caltrop core rule set that Bobro pioneered, its verbs are intrinsically tied to a longing for contact. Players can daydream about what they most desire, reach out to one of the other characters at their diner, withdraw from the world around them, or keep going, attempt to sustain a flame of interaction between two strangers. Players each also track a connection die, which mechanically represents their emotional tether to other people, whether they are fully in community or isolated. And already, that's a pretty solid set of verbs for a game about one's relationship to the world. But what elevates Nighthawks is how those rules are set in the context of its inspirational material, and how that material is employed to make the reader consider both the themes of the game and the themes of the painting. When Nighthawks appears in Nighthawks, God, this is going to be annoying to listen to, it is in pieces. Just look at the cover alone. The painting is cut into strips, pasted into a G or spiral pattern, circling around the author's name and into itself. It's a weird choice. Clayton Notestein, Ennie's judge, recent Bloggies winner, and creator of a layout template that is the backbone of the indie scene, criticized Nighthawks' dissection of the Hopper painting, saying that, quote, "Lopping off the empty edges of Nighthawks is a little like hiding Mona Lisa's smile. By cutting away the empty spaces, the book makes Nighthawks appear more crowded, busy, and intimate." And while Notestein's read is understandable, I believe the designer is making an intentional choice. So what choice is Bobro making? The cover, I think, is something of a warning and a message. Potential readers will recognize the painting, but also realize the ways in which it's been chopped and twisted. You will be drawn into the familiar, but also disoriented, which is what the game wants. It invites interpretation with the opening alone. On page 5, and to a greater degree on page 15, we see the most salient example of Notestein's criticism. We get our characters, and yes, they are bunched together, but that closeness draws into contrast how uncomfortable they all appear. The central couple cannot bear to look at each other, the clerk slogs through another evening shift, the turned man is hunched and defensive. And when you read that alongside the verbs of the game, verbs that want you to fantasize about making a connection, mechanics that make you shut the outside world down if you roll poorly, this closeness is not intimacy, but torture. I'm sure every one of us has been in a situation where we were aching for someone to acknowledge us, to look us in the face and make us feel like we belong. I still get a jab of this feeling every time I have to take lunch in a public place, that high school nightmare of stepping out into the cafeteria and drowning in the fear that everyone is looking at me. It is a truly miserable feeling to sit shoulder to shoulder with someone and realize that you are still alone. If you're reading along at home, however, you'll know that these compressed diners are not the only items on either page. They are accompanied by these blocks of all-caps text, a visual punch in the face to the uninitiated. These interstitials persist throughout the game, sudden departures from Bobro's explanation of the rules text. Before they dip their toes into game design, Bobro is a poet, and you can clearly see their prior expertise in these interruptions. They're about as subtle as a meat cleaver, but that's the point. Contrasting a well-known work about emptiness and isolation with big, punching paragraphs that lay out, explicitly, the questions the game wants you to consider, is both simple and effective. When paired with Hopper's altered scene, the reader is disoriented, and perhaps more willing to cut through their layers of self-preserving restraint and be as vulnerable as the text demands. On page 7, we get another passage, a fist of black and white crashing through the diner. The soda clerk's been socked all the way to the other side of the painting, and Nighthawks is forced to wrap back around. The left and right edges of the work are swapped. In between is an interstitial which hopes that playing the game will help you reach some sort of emotional understanding with the people you play with. It also poses an interesting question. Why not drop the pretense of this game and say what you feel? It admonishes the player for using Nighthawks as a vehicle to find vulnerability, rather than cutting out the middleman. In a conversation about distance and the contrivances we use to bridge the gaps between ourselves and others, the division of the painting reinforces that idea. The interstitial text is literally breaking the painting in half, forcing the two edges of it apart, and asking why you are not more directly bringing them back together. Twice in Nighthawks, the painting is flipped upside down and shaved into a strip that only highlights the four figures, on pages 10 and 12. Between the inversion of the painting and huge text scrawls that accompany it, these pages further disorient the viewer, and thus invite them to consider why the painting is made small and subservient to the words that dominate the pages. At least on page 10, the interstitials openly invite interpretation, lament that understanding one's intent often seems untranslatable. And page 12 is perhaps the most vulnerable passage in the game. The all-caps narrator, which, because it speaks so directly about the construction and writing of games, I believe is Bobrow himself, describes how pain has not made them better, that being a good person at all, in our world, means to neglect and damn one's own desires. These are heartfelt and painful passages, so sincere as to invite scorn, if you give any weight to concepts like cringe or cheese, which I do not. Bobrow bleeds onto the page here, and the enormity of their desire blots out the stillness of Nighthawks, turns the painting's isolation upside down, so powerful is their want. It should be noted that in March of 2020, at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns that quarantined the world, it became something of a meme to describe life as a living Edward Hopper painting. This was, of course, a navel-gazing exaggeration, but I don't think the impact of COVID can be dismissed as an influence on this game. I don't remember much about that time, besides a slurry of disappointment, fear, anger, and grief. But when you read Bobrow's pleas to be honest with each other, or their questioning of the utility of their game at all, it's hard not to view that anxiety as a product of a time period where over 1 million of their countrymen died alone and gasping, without the breath in their lungs to say anything that mattered. Both the game and its inspiration are works shrouded in the gloom of living through mass death events. One can draw a grim parallel between the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, whose aftershocks rippled through Hopper's art, and Nighthawks' publication date of December 7th, 2021. But Hopper's yearning emerged from the early years of the United States' involvement overseas. Bob Rouse's urgency springs from fully understanding the consequences of what a wave of death, one producing 3 times as many American corpses than World War II, does to a nation. There is an animal need to be understood in Nighthawks, made more ravenous by the societal trauma the creator witnessed, a hunger to shatter where its predecessor was content to simply scratch. Nighthawks hints at a subtle distress, a pained silence between the couple at the counter, but Nighthawks tears the two apart, exaggerates the distance between them, and asks if you'd recognize the name of God. In spite of the game's raw, sometimes confusing swings at the absolute need for connection, its battered and bloody ending is still hopeful. The final interstitial on page 23 lays out Bob Rouse's thesis. When I see you smile, I know I cannot be completely alone. Even if we don't ever cross paths again, you have meant enough for me to decide to live. For a text that is deeply concerned about misconnections, self-withdrawal, and the pain of being alone, this beat ends the game on a high note. It focuses on the things that did go well, the moments of shared humanity between strangers, even if they soon scatter into the dark. It's that faint hope at the core of Nighthawks that keeps it from veering into self-flagellation. It's not interested in stewing in grief. In this way, the game, consciously or otherwise, takes inspiration from an early sketch of Hopper's painting, one in which the central couple is not awkward and sullen, but turns toward each other, acknowledging their neighbor directly. Though it didn't make it into the iconic final draft, the sketch is an angle of Nighthawks that gives us another take on the scene, makes us consider an alternative narrative than that of Strangers at Dusk. According to Hopper's biographer, he wrote in his 1933 retrospective that he was uninterested in paintings that were not a record of their maker's emotions. The quote describes the act of creation as more like a wrestling match, how those who Hopper considered masters fought to bend paint and canvas to their will, struggled to translate their feelings into art. In Bob Rouse's Nighthawks, we see a similar battle, one which is openly addressed by the designer. Perfect understanding may not be the goal of translation, but I feel Bob Rouse did a pretty stellar job of grappling with their own beliefs and wrenching them into a strange, sincere game about art and the absolute need for connection. It is hard not to feel like history is once again casting a shadow over what few points of light still remain. I hope this game inspires players to strive for moments of tenderness, a flash of a smile, a turn towards a stranger, and make that agonizing choice to not let yourself be alone. Thank you to everybody for watching. I really appreciate anyone who takes the time to see what I'm saying about tabletop games. I also want to be really clear, I have nothing but respect for Clayton Notestein. I'm actually very grateful he took a mildly critical view of Nighthawks, because that insight gave me the kernel for this essay. I had wanted to write about Nighthawks before he wrote that piece, but reading his criticisms gave me a chance to write from an alternative angle, which was really helpful. The names of the people who make these videos possible are scrolling by right now. If you want to become one of those people who helps me keep the channel going, you can join my Patreon, where members will get access to all my games, as well as the option to vote on a special video at the end of the year. My background picture is Liquefied Image by Adrian on Unsplash, and my profile picture is by Eater Outsider on Tumblr. If you want to find more of my work, I'm at AAVoigt on Blue Sky, Monster Factory Fanfic on Tumblr, but my main site is aavoigt.com, where I talk about games and writing. I also do a podcast, Mortified the Friendship Quest, where me and my friend Layla do critical media analysis. We just talked about the K-drama web series Love for 1,000 More. It's a cute, weird little program that you can watch entirely on YouTube, and I think me and Layla hash out an interesting chat about what does and doesn't work for us in romance media. Thanks as always for watching. You probably won't hear from me much in March, because I'm going to be hard at work on what I hope to be a fun April Fool's video. So until then, see ya!